Hey everyone, in today's video I want to talk a little bit about teaching the suffix s and es to our students. This is definitely a skill I would teach in first grade and then review or reteach in second grade, and I recently uploaded this video right here talking about the 3 sounds suffix ed can make, and I actually have a whole free mini unit in that video, so if you're also wondering about the suffix ed, go check that one out. But in today's video I want to go over some of those rules for adding s and es to the ends of our root words, and I also have some activities that you can use to teach your students this tricky concept. If you are ready to dive in, give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let's just get started. Alright, in terms of adding the suffix s and es to our words, let's go over a few things the teacher should know before we are sharing this with our students. First, we know that s and es are suffixes that are getting added onto a root word. So if your students haven't learned what a root word and a suffix are yet, you might want to do a little pre-teaching behind that, or you might want to teach that while you are kind of teaching this unit so they know what the root word is and then that we're adding something onto the end to change the meaning of that root word. Now, suffix s and es can be added onto both nouns and verbs. So when we are adding it onto a noun, we are changing that noun from a singular noun to a plural noun. And that's the more common one, and in first grade, that's really what I'm going to emphasize to my students at first. It's just an easy way for them to really kind of see and apply this suffix. But I do also let my students know that s and es can be added to a verb as well, and it changes that meaning too. When talking about adding s or es to a verb, we do this when we are talking in third person. So for example, when I say I swim, that sounds right, we don't need to add s or es. When I say we swim, I still don't need to add that s, but if I'm talking about someone else or I'm referring to myself in third person and I say he swims, Mrs. Jones swims, Tim swims. When I'm talking about someone else or I'm referring to myself in third person, then we are going to go ahead and add that s. Now, this is something that many of your students may have already picked up, especially if they are not English language learners. They will kind of develop this ear for that doesn't sound right, or again, if I say I paint, we paint, Shelley paint. Shelley paint. We know it needs to say Shelley paints. They can hear that it sounds a little bit off, but some of your students may not know that or they haven't been exposed to that yet, so we do kind of want to help them develop this grammar ear. Okay, 2 other quick teacher notes is that when we apply s to the end of a word, it can make 2 different sounds. Sometimes s is going to make the typical sound we hear, s, but other times when added onto the end of the word, it's going to make the z sound. And there's actually a pretty simple rule for this. If s is applied to the end of a root word that ends in a voiceless sound, which is going to be these letters, F, K, P, S, and T, those letters all make voiceless sounds, then the s on the end of the word is still going to keep that s sound. If the last sound in the root word is a voiced sound, that s on the end is actually going to make the z sound. And as a quick reminder about voiced and unvoiced sounds, if you go ahead and put your hand here on your throat, you will feel if a sound is voiced or unvoiced. So you can practice some of our unvoiced sounds like s, t, p. You won't feel any vibration or movement on your throat. And if we have a voice sound, we'll be able to actually feel that vibration on our throat, like b, d. You can really feel the difference, and your students can as well. So that's just how you know what sound that s is going to make on the end of a word. Now, the other quick rule is that sometimes we don't add s to the end of a word, we add es. And we do that when our root word ends in these letters, s, z, x, and then the digraphs ch and sh. Whenever a root word ends in those letters or combination of letters, we add es as our suffix. All right, knowing all of this, how can we teach this to our students in an effective and engaging way? I'm going to go ahead and walk you through a quick lesson of what it would look like if I'm teaching this to my students. It's going to be split over 2 days because I would teach just s first and then I would go into es, and you'll see kind of how I do that, and then I will share some extension activities that I have for you, and if you stick with me, I have quite the freebie that I think you're going to like. Let's dive in. Alright, if you have followed me for a while, you may already know this, but I have a bunch of videos sharing how I teach different phonics skills. I have how to teach CVC words, how to teach digraphs, how to teach consonant blends, how to teach diphthongs, etc. I'll go ahead and list that playlist down in the description below, but the reason I bring that up is because I pretty much always start my lessons the same. All of my phonics lessons I like to begin with the sounds. You can do this in many different ways, but basically you want to spend 2 to 3 minutes on some phonemic awareness. To kick this off when teaching students about that suffix s, I would probably have them practice blending sounds and isolating that final sound. So that might look something like this. All right, everybody, we are going to practice blending some sounds together to make words. So I'm going to say some sounds and I want you to blend them together to make a real word. You probably have some hand movements they can do. We often do tapping and then kind of like zipping it across. So I would say k, a, t, s. What word does that make? Cats. Now I probably wouldn't pause and say, what word does that make? We've gotten into a rhythm now where it would just be k, a, t, s. And then they repeat cats. B, ags, bags, j, p, s, jumps. Hopefully, as you notice, all of those words are going to have an S on the end. Some of them are going to have that S sound and some will have the Z sound, and I want them to practice both. So by this point of the year, my students are used to blending 4 to 5 phonemes at one time, so this shouldn't be too difficult, but again, they are blending those sounds that I am saying and making a word. Now, another phonemic awareness activity I might want my students to do is to isolate the final sound in a word. And when I do that with my students, I tell them, all right, I'm going to say a word. I want you to tap the sounds you hear in the word, and then you're gonna punch up that last sound. So here they're identifying what's that last sound in the word. So I might give them a word like taps, t, a, p, s, taps, asks, ask, s, plums, p, z. So there you can see my students aren't blending sounds together to make words, but instead I'm giving them a word that has that suffix s on the end. They have to segment it into the phonemes and then punch up that last sound. Now I'd probably have them tap it out and punch it up a few times, and then I will go straight to, okay, no more tapping it out, just tell me that last sound. Sings, z, books, s, maps, that activity would be the last one I would do in this little series because I'm hopeful they would start to notice that they're only punching up, they're isolating that last sound, and it always seems to be s or z. So step 1 is just a quick 2 to 3 minutes of phonemic awareness practice. Step 2 is where we go right into our explicit teaching. Now when doing this with first grade students, I told you I really like to focus on that plural noun part first. It's just such a concrete way for students to understand this. So what I like to do is I like to hold something up. Maybe I hold up a sock. Put one sock here. You could do this with anything in the class, but I like to start with something that's a little, unorthodox, a little like, why is that here? Why does she have a sock in her hand? Something to get a little bit of engagement. So I would ask students, what is this? They would say, a sock. Good. Then I would go ahead and show 2 socks. And I'd say, okay, so what are these? Socks. And then I would kind of like emphasize that. Oh, okay, so this is sock and this is socks. Then I would do it again. Hold up a pencil. What is this? Pencil. Hold up 2 pencils. What are these? Pencils. After doing this a few times, I would show my students an anchor chart like this one that basically explains that when we add s to the end of a noun, we're changing the item from one to more than one. And I do like to point out to my students that it's not just 2, like we had 2 socks, I had 2 pencils. We could have 2 socks, we could have 100 socks, we could have 1,000,000 socks, but all we need is that S on the end to show us that it's more than 1. To practice this with your students, I would simply grab things I can see in the classroom and say, okay, let's practice adding S to these words, right? We have cube, what would be more than 1 cube? Cubes. We have cup, what would be more than 1 cup? Cups. We have bird. What would be more than 1 bird? Birds. Just a very simple but engaging practice for your kids. Students tend to pick up that plural noun thing pretty quickly, so I do like to let my students know that, hey, sometimes we actually add S to verbs as well. Who can remember what a verb is? It's an action word. Great. So sometimes we add S to verbs depending on how we're talking about them. And then I just give them a few of those third-party examples I mentioned earlier in the video. So I would say, if I'm talking about myself, I might say I write. If I'm talking about me and a friend, I might say we write. But what if I'm talking about Stella? Can I say Stella write? I can say, that doesn't sound right, does it? When I'm talking about someone else, we actually add that S to it. Stella writes. That makes more sense. And then you can give them a few more of those examples just so they can practice listening for when they should add that S to the end. And when I do this, I like to use students in the class. So I might say, I read, we read, Calvin reads. And just a quick note, be sure to include some pronouns as well. So I swim, we swim, she swims, just so they can hear this. All right, so with this explicit teaching part, we have shown some concrete examples. We explained that we can add it to nouns to make them plural. We explained that we also add it to verbs, and we've really had students practice orally adding this S. Now I want them to actually see what the S looks like when it's added to a root word. So again, this is still the explicit teaching part, so I will go ahead and write some words on the board. Here we have bags, and I like to include a little picture so I can show that it is clearly more than one bag. And this is where I point out that that S is going to be a suffix we add onto our root word. So the root word here is bag. I will point that out with my students, and then I'll go ahead and circle this S that's on the end, and I will ask my students to tell me what sound they hear in the word bags. In fact, I like to have them close their eyes so that way they're not seeing the S, and your students will point out that, wait, it's actually making that Z sound, bags. Then I showed this picture here. We talk about how this is a fish tank. The root word here is tank, but here we have two tanks, so we added that S onto the end. I'll go ahead and circle that again, and I'll have students say that word aloud, tanks. Close your eyes. What sound do you hear at the end of that word? Tanks. And they hear that S. And this is where you want to teach your students that when we add the S onto a root word, it can actually make two different sounds. Now, the students I've been working with do understand what a voiced sound and an unvoiced sound is. We have them practice by holding their neck like I showed you at the beginning. So I will simply and quickly just tell them when that rule applies. And then we can test it with those slides I showed. So I'll put bags back up there. Let's look at that root word. It is bag. Let's go ahead and feel the end of that word. G, g. It is voiced, so that S is going to make Z. Now let's look at tank. I hear k, k, k. It is unvoiced, so it's going to say S. So those are the different things you'll want to teach your students about this rule. Now we move on to step 3. With step 3, I really want my students just to practice some simple decoding of words with that plural S on the end. So just like those slides I shared earlier, I will throw up some slides like this right here, and I will have students read the word aloud, tags. I'll ask them to identify what the root word is. The root word is tag, and we can talk about the sound that it makes on the end. Tags. Here we have another one. Banks. What's the root word? Bank. We have S on the end. What sound does that make? S. And as always with decoding, I like to have them decode words in isolation, so just one word at a time, but then I also like to go into some phrases or some sentences. So here's an example you could put up. She sings at the shops. I want my students to be able to read this sentence. I want them to point out the words that have that suffix S on the end, and then when we do that, when we see sings and shops, we can identify the root word and talk about what sound that S makes at the end. And after our decoding is step 4, I like to have my students practice encoding as well. Now you can do this with word building, with letter tiles or letter magnets, but I usually like to have my students actually take out their whiteboard, take out a marker, and practice forming these letters. And also similar to decoding, I like to have them encode words in isolation as well as in sentences. So I would simply tell students, okay, we're gonna practice spelling some words with the suffix S on it. So I will say a word aloud, I want you to write it down. Write down the word asks. They go ahead and write it down, they hold it up, I see if it's correct, we erase, move on to the next. Write down the word hands. Write down the word cups. If students need it, encourage them to tap out the sounds they hear and then write it down. Also remind your students that if they hear that Z on the end, it's probably an S in this case, depending on the word we are sharing. And then after they write down a few words in isolation, I have them write a sentence as well. I'll have them repeat the sentence I say, he hands me 2 cubes. Then I usually have us count out how many words are in the sentence. He hands me 2 cubes. 5 words, write it down. And that right there is going to be the end of day 1 of our lesson learning about the suffix S. All right, for day 2, when we're learning about ES, I'm not going to run through each of the steps again because they're pretty much exactly the same. For step 1, again, I want to start with the sound, so I'm going to have my students blend some sounds to make words. I might also have them isolate that final sound that they hear, but this one's going to be a little trickier because that ES that goes on the end is going to make is, at the end of the word. So I do want them to hear that though. So I want them to hear these different sounds that they hear. So for this, I might actually have students listen to a bunch of words that end in ES and ask them to identify what's the same thing they hear at the end of all these words. And hopefully they notice that is sound. When we get to our explicit teaching, I will review what we talked about yesterday when we are adding S to the ends of words, and let students know that sometimes, depending on the letter the root word ends in, we are going to add ES instead of S. And I'll use an anchor chart like this one just to point out when we will do that. And then steps 3 and 4 are also the same. We go into decoding words with ES as well as encoding words with ES. And again, for both of those steps, I like to do words in isolation first and then words in a sentence. So those are some of the steps I would follow on day 1 and then day 2 when teaching my students about adding the suffix S and ES to the ends of our words. But we all know that 2 days of learning, it's not just going to make it stick for most of your students. Some might get it, and that's wonderful, but many of them are still going to need some review. So this is where we also add on our extension activities. We want to continue to review these skills, and we want to give our students plenty of practice hearing those sounds and then reading and writing the letters that make those sounds. For some quick extension activities, you can simply have a sort like this one right here. Here would be a sounds of S sort where students are reading the words aloud, and then they have to sort, do they hear S or do they hear Z on the end? And they can put them in the right spot. They could do this independently, or of course they could do this with a partner by taking turns. Another extension activity is to make little tents like this one. This is something I learned in the MZ or in Gillingham training, where you can have S, we can have Z, and we can have is. And I will say a word aloud. So here students are really focusing on that phonemic awareness, and they're isolating that last sound. So I'll say a word aloud like wishes. Students will have to hear it. What do they hear in the end? They hold up the blue to me. This is something all your students can get involved in, and we can do it pretty quickly. Cabs, and so on. You just say the word, they lift up the tent. Another extension is, of course, decodable texts. You want to make sure as you're progressing along in your phonics scope and sequence that if you have taught the S and ES suffix, you want to include those in your decodables. I have these decodable mini books right here, and I went ahead and added a couple books that have students practice that S and ES at the end of words, so they can practice decoding, again, words in isolation as well as words in sentences. And then of course there's all sorts of games that are going to help students practice writing and reading different words with S and ES. I have this roll, read, and sort game where students are going to roll the die. They will have to read the words and then again sort them based on sound. And then we also practice with this type of worksheet right here where students will see both singular and plural nouns, and they'll have to determine is it singular or is it plural, and then based on that they'll have to decide how they're going to spell the word. Here I like it because they have to decide if they need to actually apply that suffix S or ES before they do it. Now I told you if you made it this far I would have a surprise for you, and that is that most of the things I just talked about, the extension activities, the anchor charts, and the slides, I actually compiled in a big huge freebie for you. Similar to my Sounds of ED freebie, I actually compiled all of these into some teaching slides and some extension activities for you to teach your students about S and ES. If you are excited about that, please let me know down in the comments below. That way I know that all this time and effort is worth it. All right, so there was a bunch of information for you to really get started in teaching your students about that suffix S and ES. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up so I know. Remember that freebie I mentioned is going to be listed in the description, so be sure to click show more to get that, and be sure to also subscribe to my YouTube channel and click that bell. That way you're notified of every new video. See you in the next one. Bye.